On January 16, 1943, the SS Schenectady sat quietly at the dock in Portland, Oregon, a brand new Liberty ship, barely 10 weeks old, fresh from Henry Kaiser's shipyards. The morning was calm, almost eerily so. The air hung still over the water, and the crane stood motionless against the pale winter sky. No storm threatened her. No enemy submarine prowled beneath her hull. Then, without warning, the silence split. A sharp, metallic crack that echoed across the harbor like a gunshot. Within moments, the Schenectady broke completely in two. Her hull split from deck to keel, the steel tearing apart as though sliced by an unseen blade. Sailors on deck froze in disbelief, then scrambled as the bow and stern sagged in opposite directions, the ship's spine giving way while still moored safely to the pier. The Schenectady wasn't alone. That same winter, the SS John P. Gaines fractured in calm seas. The SS So Manhattan, a T-2 tanker built using identical methods, cracked so severely that her crew abandoned ship in panic. Between 1943 and 1944, over 2,500 Liberty ships reported serious structural failures, hull cracks, deck fractures, catastrophic splits. 19 vessels broke completely in half. 3 simply vanished into the cold Atlantic, disintegrating so quickly that no distress signal ever reached shore. These weren't victims of torpedoes or tempests. They were, as some sailors whispered, ships committing suicide. America had gambled everything on the Liberty ship program. After Pearl Harbor, when the nation was thrust into total war, the U.S. Maritime Commission needed cargo ships, hundreds of them, fast. Traditional shipbuilding took 8 months for a single vessel. That was too long. Henry Kaiser, a man who had never built a ship before, made a bold promise. He would mass-produce freighters as if they were automobiles rolling off Detroit's assembly lines. His Richmond, California yards became hives of industry, sparks flying, whistles blaring, welders moving in rhythm like factory hands in a symphony of steel. Kaiser's revolution was simple in concept, but radical in scale, welding instead of riveting, prefabricated sections instead of handcrafted hulls. He borrowed the logic of Ford's production line and applied it to the sea. By late 1942, his yards were launching Liberty ships in an average of 42 days. Propaganda reels praised the miracle. Rosie the Riveters became icons, though most were welders now, women transforming raw steel plates into ocean-bound lifelines. When the SS Robert E. Perry was built in just 4 days and 15 hours, crowds cheered as if America's factories had found the secret to victory itself. Allied tonnage, once decimated by German U-boat wolf packs, was being replenished faster than the Kriegsmarine could sink it. Then, without warning, the miracle began to unravel. The ships were breaking, not under enemy fire, but under their own weight. Naval architects were baffled. The welds looked perfect. The steel met every specification. The blueprints were based on proven British designs, yet the Liberty ships were fracturing like porcelain cups, dropped on stone. The cracks almost always began the same way, at the sharp corners of hatch openings, around gun mounts, along the squared-off edges of the hull. And once a crack began, it ran wild. The welded plates carried no natural stop, no rivet hole to break its path. Within seconds, the fracture could race the entire length of a ship. Investigations began. The Maritime Commission summoned metallurgists, engineers, naval inspectors. They pored over fractured hulls under floodlights, crawling through twisted steel with measuring tools and notebooks. Committees debated theories: bad steel, faulty welds, flawed design, careless inspection. But while they searched for answers, the breaking continued. Sailors whispered of cursed ships, afraid to sleep below deck, knowing that the hull beneath them might tear open without warning in the cold black water. The miracle of mass production had turned into a maritime nightmare. And then, from a place no one expected, came the answer. Her name was Bessie Hamill, a welder working the graveyard shift at Kaiser's Richmond Yard No. 3. She wasn't an engineer or a scientist. She had never set foot in a naval architecture class, but she understood steel in the way only those who work with their hands can, by its sound, its glow, the subtle way it bends beneath heat. For 8 months, she'd been welding hull sections and watching a troubling pattern. Every night, she saw her crew start their welds at the edges of plates, moving straight through to the far side in one continuous run. As each seam cooled, the steel contracted, pulling and warping the plates, tension building invisibly within the structure. She noticed that the sequence made no mechanical sense. By the time the welders finished one seam and moved to the next, the first had already locked in stress that twisted the surrounding plates. The ship was, in essence, being built with strain frozen into its very bones. It reminded her of tightening the center bolts on a wheel before the outer ones, something every mechanic knows never to do. When she voiced her concerns, her foreman brushed them off. "You're a welder, not an engineer," he told her. The sequence came from the design office, from men with degrees and titles. But Bessie Hamill couldn't ignore what she saw. In November 1943, she did the unthinkable. She bypassed her foreman and requested a meeting with the yard's supervisors, a move that could have cost her job. She brought evidence, test plates she had welded on her own time. Some, done the standard way, were warped and twisted. Others, welded from the center outward, lay flat and true. When a supervisor finally agreed to observe her shift, he saw it with his own eyes. The welders, following orders, were unintentionally torturing the steel, each cooling seam pulling tighter until the hull itself became a cage of tension. Under the microscope, the problem was clear. The construction sequence trapped residual stress throughout the ship's body. At critical points, corners of hatches, weapon mounts, deck joints, those stresses converged. When the ships met the freezing waters of the North Atlantic, the steel grew brittle. The tension had nowhere to go, but out, splitting the hull clean apart. Hamill's idea was deceptively simple: weld from the center outward, letting the stress escape toward the edges instead of collecting in the middle. Alternate locations to prevent heat buildup. Never run a single seam straight from end to end. Use a balanced pattern that allowed each weld to cool evenly. It wasn't theory, it was instinct, born from the feel of the torch and the sound of the cooling metal. By December 1943, her insight reached Henry Kaiser himself. He was under enormous pressure. Congress demanded answers. The Navy questioned his methods. To admit that the problem was not faulty materials or sabotage, but the assembly sequence itself, meant confessing that every ship already built carried a hidden flaw. Fixing it would mean halting production, retraining thousands of workers, and redesigning the very process that had made him famous. Yet Kaiser, a man of industrial audacity, didn't hesitate. He ordered immediate tests. An entire hull section was pulled from the production line for reconstruction under Hamill's proposed sequence. In a turn of quiet irony, the metallurgists and naval engineers who had spent months dissecting broken ships now found themselves taking notes from a night shift welder who had learned everything she knew from experience, not textbooks. When the torches were lit again, the shipyard's rhythm changed. The welds glowed a softer orange as workers followed the new pattern. The plates cooled evenly. The hull lay flat. When that section was later submerged in cold water for stress testing, no fractures appeared. The steel held firm, smooth as glass. The fix was rolled out across the yards. Training manuals were rewritten. New weld sequences became mandatory, and as winter gave way to spring, the cracking epidemic slowed, then nearly vanished. The Liberty ships, those steel lifelines of the Atlantic, were finally holding. It's easy, looking back, to see that as inevitable. But at the time, it was anything but. America's supply lines were hanging by threads of steel, threads that could snap at any moment. The insight that saved them didn't come from the drawing boards of Washington or the laboratories of MIT. It came from a single woman in coveralls, her face lit by the blue flame of a welding torch, trusting what her eyes and hands told her over what the paperwork said. When Henry Kaiser met her, he is said to have thanked her personally, not in front of cameras or crowds, just a quiet handshake in the yard, the sound of ship hammers echoing behind them. In that moment, a war built on industry found its humanity again. The solution hadn't been born of brilliance, but of awareness, of listening to the smallest voices amid the roar of production. And in the stillness, after the torches went cold, you could almost hear it. The faint settling creak of steel finally at peace, a ship exhaling as if relieved to hold together at last. The test results were both damning and revelatory. When Kaiser's metallurgists examined the hull sections built using traditional welding sequences against those constructed with Bessie Hamill's new method, the contrast was staggering. In the conventional builds, stress gauges recorded internal tensions exceeding 30,000 pounds per square inch, like invisible fists pressing against the steel from within, concentrated at key structural points. But the sections welded according to Hamill's sequence told a different story. The same instruments showed far lower readings, barely 12,000 psi at their highest. The steel was the same, the welds chemically identical, yet the difference in integrity was undeniable. What had changed wasn't the material itself. It was the choreography, the order in which heat met steel, and the rhythm of the men and women behind the torches. The revelation spread through Kaiser's yards like a quiet current. For the first time, the physics of the Liberty ship failures began to make sense. Steel, after all, is not lifeless. It breathes in its own way, expanding, contracting, responding to every fluctuation of heat. Under a welder's torch, its temperature can climb above 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit, glowing like molten sunrise. In that brief inferno, the molecules stretch and separate. But as the metal cools, it shrinks back, yearning to return to its original state. When that contraction is confined by cold adjoining plates, it traps tension inside the hull, a coiled energy, silent but waiting. If the welding sequence doesn't allow that stress to dissipate, it becomes permanent, locked within the ship's bones. That hidden strain alone might not have doomed the Liberty ships, but nature has no mercy for imbalances. The steel used for their hulls, a carbon-based shipbuilding grade, was perfectly adequate in mild conditions, flexible, forgiving. Yet, under the frigid breath of the North Atlantic, where water temperatures plunged below 40 degrees, the very nature of that steel changed. What had once bent under pressure now stiffened. Its ductility, its capacity to absorb and distribute stress, collapsed. The hulls became brittle, fragile in ways that no engineer in California's temperate yards could have imagined. In warm water, metal deforms slightly before breaking. In cold water, it shatters. The contrast was devastating. A microscopic crack forming at the sharp corner of a hatch or gun mount became a spark racing along the ship's length. In ductile steel, that spark would fade. In brittle steel, under trapped tension, it became a storm. The stored energy in the welds became fuel for destruction. Cracks didn't crawl. They sprinted, feeding on stress concentrations that multiplied the local load threefold. In some cases, the fracture outran sound itself, a thunderclap beneath the surface, slicing through steel before human reflexes could register. The SS Schenectady's fate suddenly felt inevitable. Built in winter, her seams carried millions of pounds of frozen tension. When the Portland morning dipped to 28 degrees, her hull turned to glass. A crack formed at a hatch corner, and finding a continuous welded path, tore clean through. No rivet holes to break the momentum, no mechanical seams to halt the cascade. Within seconds, the ship was two halves drifting apart, its destruction as silent and swift as the closing of a door. Older riveted ships didn't share that curse. Their construction was naturally discontinuous, each plate a separate element held by thousands of rivets. When a crack met a seam, it stopped. The overlapping joints, imperfect as they were, saved them. Welding, for all its efficiency, created continuity, a perfect highway for fractures to travel unimpeded from bow to stern. The strength of modern engineering had turned into its own undoing, and the shape of the Liberty ships only magnified the danger. Their square cargo hatches, specified by British naval architects for easier loading, became stress amplifiers. Sharp internal corners, neat on paper, lethal in practice, concentrated tension to deadly effect. Every wave that flexed the hull sent invisible tremors through those corners. Combined with cold brittleness and residual stress, they were fractures waiting for their cue. By early 1944, Henry Kaiser stood at a crossroads. The data left him no illusions. His shipyards, the pride of America's wartime industry, had been building steel giants with fatal flaws stitched into their cores. To continue meant gambling with sailors' lives and national supply lines. To stop meant risking the Allied war effort itself. The German U-boats were still prowling the Atlantic, and every ship mattered. But Kaiser was not a man who hesitated in the face of impossible choices. In January 1944, he did the unthinkable. He ordered a complete halt to Liberty ship production at Richmond Yard No. 2. Instead, he redirected resources to design an entirely new class of vessel, the Victory ship. This would not be a patch or a tweak. It was a complete reinvention, shaped by the hard lessons learned from fractured hulls and the quiet wisdom of a night shift welder. The decision drew outrage. Congress prepared investigations. Rivals muttered that Kaiser had lost his touch, that he was throwing away a proven design in a moment of fear. But the engineers pressed on. They started by mapping every failure, tracing each crack to its origin. Every square corner in the Liberty blueprint became a curve. Hatch openings were redesigned with smooth radii to diffuse tension instead of focusing it. The deck and hull plate thicknesses were recalculated, not to brute force strength, but to harmonize with new welding patterns. The changes rippled through every level of design. Structural frames were repositioned to align with natural stress relief points. The metallurgy itself evolved. Kaiser's team specified a new alloy, steel with a slightly reduced carbon content and an increased measure of manganese. They added small traces of nickel, rare and costly, once reserved for armor plating. At just 0.25%, it transformed the steel's performance in cold seas, restoring ductility at temperatures that had once spelled disaster. The Maritime Commission initially balked at the expense. Nickel was rationed, and the war economy had little patience for costlier steel. But Kaiser's argument was mathematical and moral. The loss of a single ship, a crew of 40 souls, 1,000 tons of cargo, and the morale that followed, cost more than upgrading 50 vessels. Numbers won the debate. By March 1944, the new steel specifications were approved. Then came the harder part, retraining the workforce. At Richmond alone, over 90,000 men and women labored across the yards, thousands of them welders who had learned their craft in crash courses lasting mere weeks. They could run a torch, but few understood metallurgy or thermal sequencing. Now they needed to. Kaiser converted entire workshops into welding schools. Experienced hands like Bessie Hamill became instructors. Welders received laminated sequence cards for every hull section, where to start, when to pause, which seems to alternate. The production rhythm slowed, then steadied. Prefabrication expanded dramatically. Instead of welding massive sections on open slipways, the shipyards broke construction into smaller modules. controlled environments where welders could follow precise sequences from the center outward. Each sub-assembly was welded, cooled, and heat-treated before being joined to the next. The hulls grew not in chaos, but in balance. Slowly, the transformation spread. Sparks still flew, but the sound changed, a steadier beat, deliberate and methodical. The Liberty's successor began to take shape, her curved hatches glinting beneath the cranes. The Victory ship was sleeker, faster, more resilient. Her hull could breathe with the sea instead of breaking against it. For the workers who'd lived through the crisis, it was redemption. They had been part of an industrial miracle that nearly turned on itself, and now they were part of its resurrection. For the engineers, it was humbling. Equations had failed where intuition had prevailed. The fix had come not from high offices or laboratories, but from the pulse of the factory floor, from someone who had watched Metal movie and listened to what it was trying to say. When the first Victory ship slid into the water, that spring, the launch felt different. There were no brass bands, no patriotic speeches, just the low hum of machinery, the splash of steel meeting sea, and a collective breath held between fear and hope. The welders stood back, faces smudged with soot and pride, watching to see if their work would hold. It did. The hull stayed firm, its seams unbroken, the water around it calm. Engineers recorded the moment like a heartbeat, returning after flatline. For Henry Kaiser, it was vindication. For Bessie Hamill, it was proof that doing what's right sometimes means standing against the current, even when no one believes you. And somewhere in that vast shipyard, as the torches dimmed and the metal cooled, the air felt lighter. The echoes of hammering steel softened into silence, and you could almost imagine the ships themselves exhaling, relieved at last to stay whole. The Skeptics had plenty of ammunition when the first Victory ship keel was laid in February of 1944. The construction took 18 days, still fast by any sane measure, but slower than the record-breaking Liberty ships that had once dazzled the public. For those watching from the outside, it seemed that Henry Kaiser's miracle machine had lost its rhythm. The newspapers, always hungry for drama, whispered that the age of American industrial wonder was over. The second Victory ship was launched in 16 days. An improvement, yes, but far from the breathless pace the propaganda reels had promised. Critics circled like gulls over a quiet harbor, declaring the program a failure, proof that you could have speed or quality, but never both. Kaiser, however, wasn't listening to the headlines. His eyes were on the inspection reports, not the calendar. When those reports came in, they told a different story entirely. The first two Victory ships showed 0 stress fractures after inspection, not fewer cracks, not acceptable imperfections, but none at all. The hulls were sound, every plate in harmony with the next. The welds held, the steel was unbroken. For Kaiser, this was the true miracle, not the speed of the build, but the silence of failure. By April 1944, Richmond Yard No. 2 had transformed into something that looked less like a shipyard and more like an immense living organism. A choreography of fire, steel, and coordination that pulsed 24 hours a day. Where once cranes and sparks moved in chaos, now everything followed rhythm and order. The yards no longer resembled the rough-and-ready industrial chaos of wartime production. They had become symphonies of motion, with each welder, fitter, and inspector moving like a note in an immense mechanical score. The process began in the prefabrication sheds, vast, cathedral-like hangars filled with the white-blue glow of welding arcs. Here, teams worked on hull sections no larger than 30 feet in any direction, each accompanied by a sequence card that looked almost like sheet music. A bottom plate assembly for example might require 47 individual welds, all numbered, color-coded, and meticulously ordered. The welders knew to begin at position 1, the geometric center, and to move outward in spirals or radiating lines. It was a ritual now. Start from the heart. Let the stress breathe outward. Never trap it within. Supervisors walked the aisles with clipboards in quiet precision, ticking boxes, correcting hands, ensuring no one ever skipped ahead. Every 10 welds, a section would be moved into a towering stress relief oven. Inside, the steel glowed orange at 2,100 degrees Fahrenheit, then cooled slowly, evenly, like a heartbeat settling after exertion. This annealing allowed the crystalline structure of the steel to relax, releasing the invisible tension that had doomed so many Liberty ships. And the steel itself, once a crude commodity, was now a carefully tuned material. Each plate arrived pre-cut and pre-formed from mills retooled exclusively for Victory ship production. Where Liberty builders had wrestled raw metal into shape on the docks, Kaiser's yards received parts ready to fit, curved bow sections pre-shaped to specification, deck plates already drilled, frames pre-welded. The improvisation of the early days was gone. In its place was precision, manufacturing as an art form. On the assembly ways, construction no longer began from a single keel laid and built upward. Instead, the Victory ships came together as immense modular puzzles. The engine rooms, cargo holds, bow and stern were each assembled in parallel, then brought together by gantry cranes in a single breathtaking act of alignment. It was no longer construction, it was orchestration. May the 12th, 1944, marked the moment the world realized what Kaiser's revolution truly meant. In just 11 hours, 17 major modules, 85% of an entire hull, were aligned and joined into one seamless vessel. Welders connected each junction using Hamill's center-outward sequence, fusing not raw steel, but pre-relaxed, stress-balanced components. The process was relentless. Materials for the day shift were positioned during the night shift. Cranes moved on pre-timed routes with 5-minute accuracy, and every welder worked in rotation, 30 minutes under the torch, 10 minutes rest, to prevent the fatigue that had once invited failure. Errors were caught before they multiplied. Mistakes were documented before they could hide. Kaiser's system was guided by what he called the critical path. Every operation that could cause delay was tracked and balanced. If frame installation got ahead of schedule while pipe fitting lagged, workers were shifted in real time. Nothing was allowed to idle. Every delay, every deviation was studied, discussed, corrected. Each morning, teams gathered under the cranes for briefings, men and women of all backgrounds, sleeves rolled, eyes fixed on charts illuminated by lamps and welding sparks. The yard had become something transcendent, something almost human in its collective precision. Then came June 27, 1944, the day the world took notice. The SS Benjamin Warner, Victory ship hull number 23, rolled out of Richmond Yard in just 5 days and 11 hours. And this time, it wasn't a stripped-down demonstration or a propaganda trick. She was a complete warship. Engines humming, defensive armaments mounted, electrical systems live, hulls sealed and perfect. Her inspection reports were pristine. No fractures, no structural anomalies, stress readings well within safe limits. When the Warner took her shakedown cruise, the ocean tested her as it had tested every Liberty ship before. Cold, hard, indifferent. But she held fast. The hull flexed with the sea instead of fighting it. The waves that once tore Liberty hulls apart now broke harmlessly against her bow. For the first time in 2 years, Kaiser stood at the pier and watched a ship disappear over the horizon without fear. That 5-day miracle wasn't about speed, it was about harmony. A demonstration that engineering, labor, and courage could coexist when driven by purpose, rather than ego. What began with one welder's stubborn observation had cascaded into a complete reformation of industrial philosophy. The Victory ship wasn't simply an improved Liberty ship. It was a new organism, born of error, and rebuilt from understanding. At a glance, they looked the same. Squat, utilitarian freighters with the same boxy silhouette. But beneath the surface, everything was different. Every weld, every plate, every grain of steel spoke a language learned through failure. The new alloy, known as killed steel because it was treated with aluminum to remove trapped gases, offered resilience the old ships could only dream of. Laboratory tests confirmed what the builders already sensed. The brittle transition temperature had dropped from 40 degrees Fahrenheit to nearly 5. That meant the hull could flex, breathe, and endure in waters cold enough to kill a man in minutes. It cost 8% more per ton, but the return was infinite. Every improvement, from the composition of the steel to the curve of a hatch corner, carried the weight of a lesson learned at terrible cost. Those rounded corners, gentle, unassuming, cut stress concentrations by over 60%. A crack that once would have sprinted through a Liberty hull now faltered, lost momentum, and died quietly in the metal. The new designs even built failure into their logic. Rather than pretending cracks would never happen, engineers accepted their inevitability and planned for survival. Hybrid connections combined welding and riveting, inserting deliberate discontinuities where cracks could exhaust themselves. Structural frames were doubled at critical points so that if one failed, another could carry the load until port repairs could be made. It was humility cast in steel, an admission that perfection is an illusion, but resilience can be engineered. The Victory ships were not just stronger, they were wiser. For the workers who watched them take shape, there was pride in knowing that their hands had turned lessons of tragedy into vessels of endurance. For Kaiser, it was vindication of faith, faith in people, in process, in the idea that innovation is born not from genius alone, but from listening to the smallest voices in the noisiest rooms. By the summer of 1944, the docks glowed with rows of these new ships, their hulls gleaming in the light of a low California sun. To the untrained eye, they were simply ships. But to those who built them, each was a living record of transformation, of human ingenuity forged in the heat of failure and cooled in the quiet patience of understanding. And when one of them slipped into the sea, the sound it made was not a cheer or a roar, but a long, steady exhale, like the sigh of steel, finally free from its ghosts. A single fractured frame in those early Liberty ships was often enough to start a chain reaction, a slow collapse that rippled through steel like a falling row of dominoes. The weight of the ship would shift, one section yielding to another, until the entire structure gave way. There was no mercy in metal once the balance broke. But the Victory ships were different. They could absorb a hit that would have doomed a Liberty ship, shrug off damage that would once have spelled certain death, and still limp their way to port. Battered, yes, but alive. It was as if the steel itself had learned endurance. The secret lay in discipline. Every weld, every joint, every seam that stitched those new hulls together followed a doctrine born from Bessie Hamill's quiet genius. Her once dismissed observations had become gospel, codified into thick manuals that governed every stroke of the torch. Those manuals stretched hundreds of pages long, dense with instructions that read less like construction notes and more like a sacred ritual. They told welders not just where to work, but when to pause, how to listen to the steel, and when to let it breathe. Each welder was trained to understand the invisible world inside the metal. Between every pass of the torch, the base steel retained heat, what they called interpass temperature. If it climbed above 400 degrees Fahrenheit, the work stopped. No exceptions, no shortcuts. The rule was absolute. Let it cool naturally, or risk building a ship with hidden strain coiled inside its bones. In the Liberty yards, welders had once raced along long seams without pause, pushing molten lines across the plates until the air shimmered with heat. The steel warped beneath them, invisible distortions locking in tension like twisted muscles under skin. That was over now. The victory ships demanded patience, measured work, deliberate cooling. Each weld became a small act of respect, acknowledging that even metal has limits. Quality control turned from a department into an obsession. When a weld was finished, it wasn't simply inspected, it was interrogated. Magnetic particle testing revealed flaws invisible to the human eye. Fine iron dust sprinkled over a weld would form ghostly patterns, tracing the whisper-thin outlines of cracks as magnetic fields danced across the surface. Ultrasonic waves were sent pulsing through joints to check for voids, while X-rays illuminated hidden imperfections in the deepest seams. The results were recorded on permanent film, a photographic truth that could not be argued with. In the early months, the rejection rate was brutal. Nearly 15% of welds failed to meet the new standards. Welders were frustrated, foremen anxious. But as weeks passed, hands grew steadier, instincts sharper. By the middle of 1944, the rejection rate had dropped below 3%. What once felt like punishment now became pride. They weren't just building ships anymore. They were crafting survival. The proof came not in charts or memos, but in the cold arithmetic of the sea. Between June 1944 and August 1945, 531 victory ships entered service. Not one broke in half. Not one vanished beneath the waves due to structural failure. Only a handful ever reported cracks at all, and those were found early. Small stress marks halted, repaired, and returned to sea within days. It was a triumph born from tragedy, written in steel instead of ink. The numbers told one story, but the ocean told another. In April 1945, off the coast of Okinawa, the SS Wanda Fuka struck a mine. The explosion tore a 20-foot wound in her hull below the waterline. The crew braced for the sound every Liberty sailor dreaded, that eerie metallic snap that meant the hull had started to rip apart. But it never came. The crack ran until it hit the first riveted arrest seam and stopped, just stopped. The Wanda Fuka limped into port under her own power, patched in 6 days, and returned to duty. A Liberty ship in the same situation would not have been so lucky. 2 months earlier, the SS Richard Hovey had taken a similar hit and split open like a dropped shell, snapping her keel in 14 minutes. 37 men went down with her. It was a contrast so stark it felt almost biblical. One ship surviving, another consumed by the same ocean. By 1944, as American forces clawed their way across the Central Pacific toward the Philippines and Japan, those differences began to shape the war itself. Every island taken, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, was supplied by steel hulls that crossed thousands of miles of open water. For the Liberty ships, each voyage was a gamble. Captains ordered slower speeds to reduce hull stress, and cargo loads were trimmed to ease the strain on brittle steel. Every creak, every groan of the hull in cold seas was a warning. Some men refused to sleep below deck. The victory ships changed all of that. They ran heavier loads at full design speed, 15 knots, a full 3 faster than their predecessors, through storm and swell. Without hesitation, the sailors no longer feared the cold. They respected it, yes, but they trusted their ship to hold. Between D-Day and VJ Day, those vessels carried more than 18 million tons of cargo across 2 oceans. Not a single one was lost to structural failure. They sailed through Arctic waters so cold that steel could shatter like glass, and still they held together. The SS Hobart Baker made 17 convoys to Murmansk, those perilous Murmansk runs through seas that broke Liberty ships in half, and returned each time unscathed. The Liberty ship John Walker, sent on the same route, cracked on her second voyage and never went north again. The difference wasn't just technical, it was psychological. In oral histories recorded years later, sailors spoke not of machinery, but of fear, how it had lived with them on every Liberty ship, like an uninvited passenger. They described nights when the cold crept through the hull and every groan sounded like a death sentence. Some men refused to sail certain vessels known for their cracking histories. The Liberty fleet had carried not just cargo, but quiet dread. The victory ships replaced that fear with confidence. Sailors trusted them. They pushed harder, worked faster, fought rougher seas, because they knew the steel beneath their boots would not betray them. That confidence rippled through every mission. Ships turned around faster in port, took bolder routes, even maneuvered aggressively under air attack. At Leyte Gulf in October 1944, 16 victory ships braved typhoon winds and kamikaze attacks to deliver ammunition and fuel. Bombs fell close enough to lift some hulls from the water, shockwaves buckling deck plates, bending frames, but the ships held. The SS Kyle Johnson took near-miss damage that warped 3 frames and left cracks spidering across her deck. She stayed on station for 4 days, unloading supplies under fire before finally withdrawing for repairs. A Liberty ship with similar wounds would have been abandoned. War, however, measures its truths not in metal, but in mathematics. And those numbers were unflinching. A Liberty ship cost around $2 million to build. A victory ship, about $2.6 million, 30% more. But Liberty ships had a 4.6% chance of catastrophic failure during service, based on records through 1944. Every loss cost not just the hull, but 18 lives on average, and cargo worth 3 to 5 times the ship's value. Victory ships had a 0% failure rate. The extra cost, $600,000 per ship, was recouped within 6 months of operation simply through the absence of disaster. By war's end, sailors had coined a grim little saying that captured the contrast perfectly. Liberty ships were built by the mile and cut off by the yard. Victory ships were built by the inch and measured by the year. Those inches mattered. Each one represented care, patience, the slow art of precision replacing the reckless rush of necessity. Inch by inch, weld by weld, those ships were built not for glory, but for endurance. They were the quiet promise that industry could learn humility, that mistakes could become lessons instead of graves. And somewhere back home, Bessie Hamill packed her tools in 1946 and went quietly back to civilian life. No medal, no headline, no speech. Just a letter of commendation from her supervisor and the satisfaction of knowing she had changed the course of a war without ever firing a shot. History rarely remembers the hands that guide the torch. The men who wrote the reports and published the equations took credit in the years that followed, mathematical models and papers filled with formulas describing the discoveries she'd made through intuition and experience. Her name was absent from the journals, but her fingerprints ran through every ship that survived the sea. In the end, her story wasn't about recognition. It was about resilience, of steel, of will, of one woman who saw what others overlooked. And every time a victory ship crested a storm without breaking, somewhere, the faint echo of her wisdom rang through the hull, steady and low, like the heartbeat of the ocean itself. For decades after the war, welding textbooks spoke solemnly about stress relief sequencing, the method that saved ships, industries, and countless lives, but never about the woman who first saw its necessity through the shimmer of her own torch flame. Her name was absent, quietly erased by time and convention, yet her fingerprint endured, pressed deep into the bones of modern engineering. Every welded structure today, whether a skyscraper defying the wind, a bridge spanning a restless river, or a pipeline buried in frozen tundra, owes something to what was discovered in that California shipyard in 1944. Her insight became invisible scaffolding, holding up the modern world. In 1947, just 2 years after the war's end, the American Welding Society published its first structural welding code. Buried within its dense pages was a simple truth, now formalized as law. Weld from the center outward, relieve the stress. let the steel breathe. What Bessie Hamill had once explained in practical human terms, watch how the plates pull, how the seams twist when you rush the order, was now immortalized in cold, technical language. Her method had crossed the threshold from intuition to institution. 3 decades later, halfway across the world, her principles would again prove vital. This time, across the vast, frozen expanse of Alaska. The engineers designing the Trans-Alaska Pipeline faced a challenge few had imagined. More than 800 miles of welded steel carrying hot oil through landscapes colder than any shipyard welder had ever known. Sub-zero winds swept across tundra where metal could fracture like ice. They turned to the lessons of 1944. The victory ship sequencing methods, once born in wartime urgency, became the backbone of peacetime. Resilience. The welders who joined that pipeline worked with precision, learned from Hamill's unseen hand, controlling heat, managing stress, ensuring that the steel, no matter how cold the world around it, would not betray them. Bridges, too, learned the hard way. In December 1967, the Point Pleasant Bridge in West Virginia collapsed, plunging 46 souls into the icy Ohio River. The tragedy shook engineers across the nation. The investigation traced part of the failure not to rust or poor materials, but to something more insidious: residual welding stress. The welds had been executed without proper sequencing. The steel had been forced, its tensions trapped within. It was, once again, the same lesson the victory ships had taught decades earlier, that even the strongest material can break, if not allowed to rest. In the aftermath, the engineering codes were rewritten. Sequencing and inspection protocols, born from the shipyards of Richmond, were made mandatory. Every bridge built since carries a ghost of that discovery. When the Golden Gate Bridge underwent its seismic retrofit in the 1990s, thousands of tons of reinforcement were added, all welded under strict sequencing simulations, guided by computer models. Each weld was planned like a breath, applied, paused, cooled. Sophisticated algorithms replaced Bessie's eye and touch, but the essence remained hers. The same rhythm she'd felt through her gloves, listening to the steel hum and sigh, now echoed in digital form through machines she never lived to see. Still, the world has a way of relearning lessons through pain. The offshore oil industry, eager to conquer the deep, found itself repeating history. In 1980, the Alexander Keelan platform in the North Sea, an immense floating city of steel, capsized, taking 123 workers with it. Investigators traced the catastrophe in part to fatigue cracks that began in improperly sequenced welds. 8 years later, another platform, Piper Alpha, erupted in fire off the coast of Scotland, killing 167 men. At the core of that disaster, too, was a crack, small, silent, and born of residual stress, left unrelieved. Each time, investigators returned to the same truth rediscovered in those shipyard ovens 4 decades earlier. Each time, they wrote new safety codes that echoed Hamill's forgotten wisdom. Modern offshore welding standards now require mandatory stress relief heat treatments for critical joints, a direct echo of the same furnaces that once glowed red in Richmond, where Henry Kaiser's welders had baked stress out of their ships before sending them to war. But perhaps nowhere has her influence reached deeper or higher than in the nuclear age. The reactor vessels that hold the heart of atomic power are built from massive steel shells, each weld a potential fault line between safety and catastrophe. Engineers plan every weld in advance, modeling temperature gradients, cooling rates, and stress flows on computers capable of billions of calculations per second. Before the first spark touches steel, the vessel's future has already been mapped in simulated heat and pressure. And when the final seam is laid, the entire assembly is placed inside a colossal furnace for post-weld heat treatment, just as those ship sections had been in 1944. It is a direct lineage, straight from a woman hunched over a test plate in a wartime yard, to the nuclear reactors that power modern cities. The engineers of the 1950s knew this well. They studied the victory ship archives, the metallurgical reports, the sequencing diagrams, and built the next age of engineering upon them. Hamill's revelation did more than change how ships were built. It changed how engineers thought. Before those ships, design and fabrication were separate worlds. The engineer drew the plans. The worker executed them. Each blamed the other when things went wrong. But the war and the failures it revealed forced a reconciliation. Victory ships proved that the process of building mattered as much as the blueprint itself. A perfect design executed in the wrong sequence could fail. A modest design built with care could endure forever. This philosophy seeped into every modern discipline. In universities, engineering students began to study not just what to design, but how to build. Manufacturing was no longer an afterthought. It became part of the design itself. The lessons of that warship, those seams, those stress curves, those hours spent watching the color of heat, became foundational knowledge. And that, perhaps, was the quietest miracle of all. The 5-day construction timeline often made headlines, but it was never the real achievement. The real triumph was the courage to slow down, to stop production in the middle of a war, when time itself felt like a weapon, and admit that something had to be done differently. Henry Kaiser could have kept building Liberty ships, launching them at record speed, sending more and more steel hulls across the sea, and losing more and more men to invisible fractures. Instead, he stopped. He listened to a welder, a woman in an age when few would have listened, and he changed everything. That act of humility became a blueprint for all industries that followed. The willingness to question established doctrine, to treat the insights of workers not as noise but as signal, that was the true revolution. From that seed grew every modern system of continuous improvement, from Lean to Six Sigma to total quality management. Each carries the same unspoken creed. The observer closest to the process often sees what the engineer cannot. By the time Bessie Hamill passed away in 1987 in Sacramento, her name had long since vanished from the papers. Her obituary was modest, just a few lines noting she had worked in wartime shipyards. No mention of her discovery, no citation in the textbooks. Yet, her legacy surrounded her. The bridges that spanned the rivers of her country, the pipelines carrying oil across frozen plains, the towers that reached into the clouds, all were her children in steel. Every one of them whispered her language through their welds, the steady pulse of stress relieved and balance restored. It's easy to forget that history is often shaped not by grand speeches or sweeping gestures, but by quiet eyes that notice something small and refuse to look away. Bessie saw steel twist and ripple, and she wondered why. She asked questions no one else bothered to ask, and in doing so, she changed the architecture of endurance itself. The world she left behind was bound together by her invisible hand. Every welded bridge, every oil platform, every nuclear vessel stands today as silent testimony to one welder's refusal to accept that's just how it's done. She left no statue, no medal, no headline, only strength made visible through the joining of metal, cooled in patience, and held forever in balance. If you listen closely, beneath the hum of a city, the groan of a bridge, the deep, slow heartbeat of an engine, you might still hear it. The faint sound of a torch being set down, the quiet exhale of steel, finally at peace.